let's introduce our panel of experts. We're joined by Dhiraj Nayyar. He's the chief economist with the Vedanta Group, has previously served in the Niti Aayog. We're also joined by Saumen Chattopadhyay. Mr. Chattopadhyay is an economist. Welcome to the program, sir. Madhavan, Narayanan, veteran journalist who's been, in fact, a finance journalist for many years of his journalistic life, is also with us. And Ashwini Deshpande, well-known economist at the Ashoka University, is with us as well. Rajat Sethi should be joining us in a moment from now. Let me actually start with you, Dhiraj, if I can, as somebody who's seen life from both sides, as the Joni Mitchell song goes, Niti Aayog, as well as now serving in a private group. In our previous hour of analysis, we had Sanjay Baru describing this as a Nehruvian budget, which he actually said was a good thing. He said after reviling Nehru, we're back to Nehruvian economics because the entire thrust on public spending as a vehicle to bring in private spending is a very old welfare idea borrowed from Nehru. Is that how you see it? And how do you think the corporate sector, the private sector is actually seeing this budget today? Dhiraj?
I don't think it's a Nehruvian idea or budget. It's a Keynesian idea. I mean, it was John Maynard Keynes who came up with the public spending idea during the Great Depression and its aftermath. So I think, yes, it's not, Nehruvian economics was a little more than that. It was not only about public spending, it was about public sector, regulation. There's a lot more to that. So I wouldn't go quite as far as to saying it's a Nehruvian budget, but yes, it's a Keynesian budget for sure, in the sense that you're using government investment to boost economic growth. And I think in a way that's the only thing they can do right now, because if you look at the other components of GDP, which is private consumption or private investment or net exports, those are not contributing positively to economic growth. Private consumption is still depressed post COVID. Private investment cycle has not revived. In fact, it was down even before COVID. And net exports, as we know, exports have gone up, but our imports are even higher. So in terms of contribution to GDP, the only sector which is contributing is government spending. And I think the government had no choice but to enhance its capital expenditure and go that way. Because if they don't do that, then your levers of growth are very limited at this particular point in time. Because I think private investment and private consumption will still take some time to recover, given that we're not quite out of the pandemic.
Was there a standout moment in the budget that stood out for you? Obviously, the thrust was on government spending. No change in income tax for personal income tax. Neither any relaxation in corporate tax or a capping of corporate tax, as some industry leaders had pushed for. A thrust, of course, on infrastructure with the announcement of the Prime Minister's scheme on that. Was there anything that surprised you, Dhiraj?
No, I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that there were no real big announcements in terms of new schemes and new plans. It was mostly a continuation of the same, which I think is the correct thing to do at this point in time. In fact, to the extent I heard some of your panelists in the earlier discussions saying, there should have been more spending on social and safety nets and so on. But I think the fact that the government did not do that during the worst of the COVID pandemic, it's pretty clear now that we're more or less coming out of it. With the vaccination thing and Omicron being milder, I don't think this is the point at which they were going to put any more into social safety nets. So I think the big standout for me is that they didn't do any big ticket new schemes or announcement. It's basically a consolidation exercise, and the focus is right in terms of infrastructure spending, government spending. And I was interested that they did say that they're going to go into a new phase of ease of doing business. And here I'm coming from the corporate side, where they would want to move to a trust-based system. So I think this is a little underestimated, because I think trust between the government, private sector, and citizens has all suffered in the last decade or so. And I think until you build that trust and build the trust-based governance, if everything is going to be subjected to the microscope, then the speed at which you want to progress will be very slow. It will not happen that rapid speed. It will be very slow. So I think that trust-based governance, if they do go beyond, it's not a budget thing as such, because it doesn't involve spending money or raising revenue. But if they do go to that in the next phase of reform, I think that will be something the corporate sector would look forward to. But right now, I think the corporate sector would be happy with the government continuing to do capital spending, because that's what is going to boost demand.
Yeah. So consumption being buoyed right now by government spending in the hope that it will bring in private investment. Very little talk about FDI, foreign direct investment. And as Dhiraj interestingly mentioned, no big ticket social spending schemes really Even more surprising, because there are elections right around the corner, including the critical election of Uttar Pradesh, the government has resisted that urge. But Professor Ashwini Deshpande, if I can bring you in, there are those who are saying it's not therefore a pandemic budget. It hasn't, though there were references again and again by the FM to the devastation of the budget, there was nothing as such other than increased government spending that acknowledged that devastation, aside from, let's say, the allocation for the MSMEs, the medium and small enterprises, the 200,000 crores that we saw. Go ahead, ma'am, with your thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm listening to all of you and wondering whether I heard a different budget speech than you guys did. Maybe I did, but I honestly was struck by the absence of several words in the budget. For example, jobs, employment, inequality, poverty, lack of livelihoods, health. The pandemic is waning. Hopefully, Omicron is probably milder, but COVID is nowhere near gone. That's number one. Secondly, the economic devastation of the last 2 years that was unleashed by the pandemic, because of which informal sector workers lost their jobs, MSMEs don't have payroll support. There was absolutely no reference to that. We even forgot that the NREGA by October had run out of money to pay salaries to NREGA workers. So the lack of these terms in the budget, I don't see that as a positive step. The only government expenditure that got talked about was the capital expenditure, and we need to look at the numbers a little bit to see how much of the earlier schemes are included in this particular announcement. In fact, the budget was really low. The speech was really low in numbers. I'm sure there are numbers in the document, which of course.
Well, the documents, we're trying to go through the documents in real time, and
but
you do have some details. For example, the Narega numbers are actually down. The Narega numbers are actually down. And agricultural allocation is also down. So we have all of those numbers coming in the fine print. But go ahead, Ms. Deshpande.
Yeah, no. So, for example, I was looking at the economic survey, and if you look at the expenditure on health, according to the economic survey, it's still below 2%. So we are just hopefully on the last legs of one of the severest health crises that this world has ever seen. And India, which already has an abysmally poor allocation to health and social welfare, is not just health but other things as well. And I think that the acknowledgement to the hardships that people have suffered over the last 2 years, the acknowledgement of the loss of jobs, the complete lack of acknowledgement of the employment crisis. Not even the word employment gets mentioned. There's been the Pew report. There have been other inequality reports. Mention has been made about corporates. The fact is that even within corporates, there's an extreme concentration of wealth with two particular industrial houses. So I think at some point we need to acknowledge these realities. This is not a question of the election or this or that year or any of these. These are just realities in the country, and are we really do we really believe schools have been closed for 2 years? India, I think, is just above Uganda in the world for the number of days of school closure. And the digital divide means that the majority of Indian children have not had formal education for 2 years. So I think there's no harm, absolutely, in recognizing these realities. Not just that there's no harm, I think it's imperative on us to recognize the realities that shape India.
Let me bring it to two very different perspectives from Ashwini and Dhiraj. Madhavan, let's bring you in at this point. When we were talking about the economic survey just yesterday, you were on this platform. I think there was some questions raised about how do you reconcile all of the inequality reports with the government's belief that all is well. If 84% of Indian households, for example, have shown reduced income, as the Oxfam Inequality Report talks about, those are salaried classes and even poorer lower income groups, but salaried classes in particular that will be looking, for example, for some exemption in personal income tax. That did not happen. Were you surprised, Madhavan?
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all. You see, what is happening is that this government has an ideological belief in what it calls Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. But if you look hard, it means that it ideologically does not believe in proactive action for egalitarianization of the society. Let's be very clear. Ashwini, Dr. Ashwini Deshpande talked in a very moral sense about the social inequities and some of the missing numbers. But, I hope I got the name right. But the important point to remember, Barkha, is that this party, if I may use a Hindi slogan, does not believe in samta. It only believes in vikas. It believes in development in a sense of growth for all. And whoever wants personal gains out of this development model has to clamber on to a bandwagon driven by high capital expenditure. Even farm allocation is surprisingly very marginally up in this budget, as if to say, I don't expect UP and Punjab farmers to vote for me anyway too close. So let me do a lot of the spending on the industrial demand side. And within that, with a huge bias towards bigger projects like expressways. And even MSMEs, if you look at it, the spending is more in terms of credit guarantees. It is like a backstop. It is not raining money on the MSMEs. So you have to sort of assume that the big money will be spent. The small industries will try to hang to the coattails of that thing, and the working class will be still on the tail. Therefore, there is a certain trickle down model, or a come and join me model, as I call it. So,
Okay,
this
hang on. The
is
last few words of yours bunched up, but I think that the what I'm hearing you say, the very interesting sentence, that they believe in Vikas but not Samta. And we've got Rajat Sethi, who's of course an advisor to the Manipur Chief Minister, also joining us. But I just want Dhiraj, if you will, to respond to that, and then we'll get Rajat to
no, no.
chip in as
Let
well
me
and
let me
respond.
also,
Okay, complete.
Barkha, let me
Yeah.
let me complete by saying I have a minor point to quibble with Dhiraj, who's uh, comes from a family of economists who I've known all, including his late mother, who was a wonderful expert on rural development, who passed away least recently. This is my chance to pay my tribute to her. The important point to note is that although the budget may be more Keynesian than Nehruvian in the sense technically interpreted by uh, Dhiraj, the point is that the PLI scheme, on which much has been talked about, 6 million new jobs coming, essentially is nothing but Bombay plan for the 21st century. Bombay plan, which Nehru has been much lauded or criticized for, depending on which side you're on.
Okay.
So there is a certain commanding heights syndrome, because in India, there is another saying that in the long run, we are all
We're all
Keynesians
dead.
now. So,
Okay.
or we are all
All
Keynesians
dead.
now. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I have to quibble on that. But having said that, let me say that the MSME bias is more apparent than real. And farmers have been virtually given only tokenist benefits. And there has been no proactive engagement on equality.
Okay, I'll get Dhiraj to briefly respond, and then we'll get Rajat Sethi and Professor Saumen Chattopadhyay. Dhiraj, go ahead.
So my view is that we are too much we've always been a slice of cake rather than size of cake economy. So we all would rather talk about the slice before the size, and frankly that's been our problem, that we talk about slices without growing our size enough. So we have how many, I mean, again, there are so many sectors: agriculture, health, education. I agree, all of them could do with more money. Similarly, roads, highways, but the government only has a certain amount of resources, and it will not have more resources until we grow faster. So I think the emphasis at this point has to be on growth. The size of the cake is as important as the slice, because without the size growing, you're not going to be able to do very much in terms of inequality. Sure, you can pull down the rich and wealthy, and like we were in the past, everybody becomes poorer, but you're not all going to become richer by doing that. So I still think, and I disagree that this government doesn't care for the poorest sections. I think in terms of delivery of public services, including the ongoing Nal Jal program, which is taking tap water to homes, whether it's the LPG cylinder, the benefits have actually, in the first term of Mr. Modi, when I did work in the government, I saw those numbers. They have reached the poor and those who deserve them much more than before, partly because of technology, of course. But I think the intent in terms of delivering what are not only public goods but private goods to the poorer sections of society. I mean, water may be a public
Okay.
good in a sense, but private goods has been there. So I think, I mean, what do you, I mean, in terms of addressing inequality, I mean, short of saying that you tax the rich at 70% and transfer it to the poor, which we've done before at 90%, in Indira Gandhi's time, it didn't lead us anywhere. So I think the inequality, I'm not saying that inequality is not important, but how you approach it is important. So I think
Sure.
until we get growth going again, and
Let
we
me.
do have enough welfare schemes running well to ensure some amount of the
Yeah.
basic needs are the people more than before.
Well, one thing I will say is, one, of course, the budget documents are still to be read by all of us, and there'll be a lot more in the fine print. But secondly, this government is also known to make some of its big ticket announcements off the budget, if they're not necessarily made in the budget. So I first wouldn't be so convinced that you will not see more announcements from the government in the run up to the elections. As they say, watch this space. Secondly, Rajat, we had Dr. Ashwini Mahajan on the platform earlier, and he said he thought this was a Swadeshi budget, which I found quite interesting. The emphasis on welfareism. Ms. Deshpande says that she heard a completely different budget. So as always, people look at it through their own politics and their own ideological frameworks. Go ahead. To me, it seems a very cautious, sturdy budget, if I may use that word. It seems just a sturdy, consolidating budget, not a budget that's a pandemic budget, not a budget that's a reform-oriented budget, just a very careful budget. That's the adjective I'd use. Madhavan's disagreeing with me completely. What's the word you'd use, Rajat?
I think it's a growth budget. It's a budget which lays the building blocks, the foundation for an economy where the world is looking up to. India just doesn't have India's own aspirations to lift. It has to lift the aspirations of the whole world. And marching on from a 9% growth this year to 8.5, and then sustaining the momentum. All of this requires that we steer away from, any urge for populism, any urge for very limited myopic view around elections, and focus more around more fundamental issues that are ailing our economy, and try and address those things. Use the confidence and the mandate that the public has bestowed upon this government to do fundamental shifts in the economy, wherein this annual ritual that is there, that we need to have a very transactional expectation from the budget that reduce our income slabs and give us some kind of a dose here and there. That urge should be, over time, should be removed from the anticipatory sort of a matrix from a common man's standpoint.
What for you, Rajat? Sorry, what for you was the most important announcement in the budget, Rajat?
Well, I think all-out focus on reinforcing the theme of Atmanirbhar Bharat, reinforcing and doubling down on the vision that India has laid before us. That for the next 3-4 years, it is very, very critical that we are able to target the future growth-oriented sunrise sectors, bring in jobs in these sectors wherein China would be on the larger game, might not be able to serve the world, which it has been doing for a fair amount of time for the past 2 decades. Can India fill in those big shoes? Everything is oriented towards that. And that's the biggest takeaway for me in this budget.
Okay, what's interesting is we are getting some details, Professor Chattopadhyay. As we said, we need to go through the fine print, and there's actually been a certain amount of cut in fertilizer subsidies, which is significant, as well as in food subsidies. You'll see those details on the banners shortly. But Professor Chattopadhyay, that's the point, right? It is in fact not a populist budget with one eye on the elections, which is the point that Dhiraj was talking about. And depending on your politics, that's either a good or a bad thing. Go ahead, sir, with your thoughts. Just to say, fertilizer subsidies are down from 1.440 lakh crores, for example, to 1.05 lakh crores in financial year 23. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. In order to situate the agriculture sector and what has happened with the fertilizer subsidy, you have to understand the larger picture. I mean, the larger picture has already been well explained by the fellow panelists. But what is important here, that how we are going to achieve growth. There is a tremendous boost to the private sector. I heard the FM saying PPP and the multiplier quite a good number of times in a speech. And how the private sector is given a boost through PPP, that is a supply side measure, as well as through a tremendous increase in the capital expenditure, which is going to be financed by the increased momentum in the tax revenue. Now, within it, if you look at the growth, you will see that the empowerment of the people is not featuring. You see, the capital expenditure will definitely create employment opportunities. But as Ashwini pointed out, that our expenditure on education and health will be possibly maintained now. And our education budget is not yet very clear. But the thrust is very clear that education, broadly defined, is being reoriented towards skill. So the job market is a very important parameter, is a very important pillar for the sustainability of growth, which is equitable. Now, in that fertilizer subsidy in agriculture, I won't be able to comment on agriculture because I generally focus on the social sector and the macroeconomic stability. But the overall point is very clear. The raise tax and raise capital expenditure, and that is expected to percolate down. But what is not going to happen, that the inequality is likely to get worsened. We have not done enough for the plight of the people afflicted during this particular pandemic period. Yeah.
Okay. Let me take this back to Madhavan. Madhavan, when I said that this is a kind of conservative, sturdy budget, and by conservative, I don't mean conservative as in right of center economics, but conservative as a characteristic of low risk, cautious, government spending oriented budget. You were disagreeing quite vehemently.
Absolutely.
Why is that?
I'm glad you noticed me, Barkha. The point is that this is actually a visionary budget. Let me agree with Rajat Sethi, which I often don't, which is that actually this budget is an excellent blueprint for a very futuristic economy. On everything from drones to multimodal transport to Vande Bharat trains. It has a very China syndrome to it. We want to be the next China. We're not going to be left behind. Let's catch up with them, kind of a thing. But China has had a communist history in which there's been an intervention towards the bottom of the society. Even recently, the Chinese government cracked down on big tech, which are companies. Now, that kind of thing is not happening here. Having said that, let me also say that this is a visionaries budget because some of the aspects, including urban planning.
So by visionary, do you mean it as a compliment, or do you mean that it's a budget or do you mean that it's a budget for another time, not for this time?
No. Let me explain. It needs some nuances. It's visionary because I've also been a technology correspondent. I've been watching the fourth industrial revolution. So there's a huge amount of spending towards emerging opportunities, which I regard as positive, very big positive, because you always catch the next bus. You don't look for the last bus. That way, it's visionary. The other thing of spending a lot to improve manufacturing jobs or infrastructure is also very good. But where it might falter is, let me draw my cricketing analogy, which I always do. It's a stroke-filled budget trying for big swipes on the onside in the hope that there will be no one at mid-on to catch you or mid-wicket to catch you. Inflation and oil prices are a very big threat. So the big way to look at it is, it's strong on vision, maybe it's faulty on sight, which means that you may not be looking at a fielder lurking there at a high oil prices. And let me also bring in one thing which most panelists don't seem to have ignored, which is the sovereign green bond proposal, which means that, like you mentioned, FDI is not hot on this. First of all, a lot of FDI is raining on the unicorns. So we already are looking good on the FDI side in some ways. But on the infrastructure side, on the environmental side, this unicorn kind of startup investments won't be good enough. For that, the sovereign green bond seems like a good idea, but I don't know who will be buying the bond because at what rate? There may be cheap Japanese money or Abu Dhabi money waiting to come into India here. Maybe there is a Dr. S. Jaishankar angle to this whole budget that we might have missed. But as Jairam Ramesh pointed out, you can't be talking of a climate action and environmentally sustainable budget while talking about linking rivers, which environmentalists don't like.
Sure. Now, let me just jump in here. One of the things.
Let me just say one point, Barkha, which is my key takeaway today, which is that this is a political risk for the government, because if the spending is so huge on the demand side, and if they're going to go into an election year in 2024, the gap between the spending and inflation might be such that it might be a danger politically for this government, and particularly because
therefore we have to wait to see. Therefore, we have to wait to see whether this is the last we've heard in terms of announcements. Madhavan, let me just hold you there.
Let me just complete. The sequencing of the spending will be very important, and most important, political inflation is not the economist's idea of an inflation based on base numbers and all. It's all about what will onion cost me compared to last year.
And to that extent, the fact that the rising oil prices have not been in fact addressed is something that could hurt the government politically, is the point that Madhavan is making. Two excerpts I want to play out from Nirmala Sitharaman's speech, and then we can get responses to it. One, the recognition of a digital rupee. What does that actually mean for cryptocurrency and so-called crypto tax? Listen.
introduction of a central bank digital currency will give a big boost to digital economy. Digital currency will also lead to a more efficient and cheaper currency management system. It is therefore proposed to introduce digital rupee using blockchain and other technologies to be issued by the Reserve Bank of India starting 2022 and 23. The magnitude and frequency of these transactions have made it imperative to provide for a specific tax regime. Accordingly, for the taxation of virtual digital assets, I propose to provide that any income from transfer of any virtual digital asset shall be taxed at the rate of 30%, 30%.
Okay, so a crypto tax was the one sort of talking point of the budget. And the other talking point, of course, was the FM's emphasis on the GST collections, while there was no change at all in the personal tax slab. So listen in on that, and then we can get all of you to react.
I would like to bring to the notice of this House that the gross GST collections for the month of January 22 are rupees 1,40,986 crores, which is the highest since the inception of GST.
Okay, so there we've got Rajat back with us, but I just want to go to Dhiraj first. We are seeing now some details that are coming in. One is a reduction in various subsidies. Fertilizer as well as petroleum subsidies is now confirmed is at 5,813 crores, and it was at 6,517 crores. Sorry, I'm reading off the column because these are documents that we're still going through. Dhiraj, is that surprising given what's happening with oil prices? That the government would dare to reduce subsidies is actually quite an intriguing idea in this season of elections. I mean, I say dare only in a political context, not in any other context.
I don't think so, again, because a large part of the petroleum prices are now deregulated. Except for the LPG subsidy, which goes to targeted households, the rest of the prices are deregulated. I think the risk in terms of oil price, I mean, I really don't know what the budget could have done apart from mentioning it in words in terms of oil prices. The risk really is that if oil prices go to 100 and above, which could happen, is that it'll put pressure on inflation on the one side, yes, but on taxes, because the government has been mopping up a lot of revenue because of its taxation on petroleum products, right? So either they'll have to cut those taxes, or they'll have to let retail prices of petrol and diesel hit the roof. So I think that may cause them a problem on the revenue side as well, apart from the inflation side, if oil prices do go up. But I don't see any. I mean, I think given the deregulation, I don't see petroleum subsidies in particular to be a very big item anymore.
Rajat, do you want to add to that? I think that's a fair point. One that is not as political a hot potato issue as it once used to be, given the deregulation. And secondly, that the increased spending, has to be adjusted somewhere in the books, I think is what Dhiraj is saying. And then I'll come to Ashwini. Go ahead, Rajat.
Right. So the only thing that could have been done on oil, on petrol and diesel, essentially should have been reflected in excise duty. Given that the government of India had recently reduced it by rupees 10 for diesel and 5 for petrol, they have already incurred a net loss to the exchequer to the tune of 35,000 crores. Now, I don't see within such a short span, government was expected to further reduce it. And therefore, as per our expectations, things did not change on the excise duty structure-wise side. So don't just go by the subsidies. These subsidies are on very small, petroleum products which are used for certain industries, etc., and certain subsidies are earmarked for that. So that's a very different sort of a topic, a budgetary item, which we should not read too much into. But I think the sort of domino effect that inflation triggered by oil prices globally can have is definitely there. That risk is there. The bigger risk that is there is globally we are seeing that there is a spurt of inflation, unprecedented level, which we haven't seen for the past several decades. And I think this is where, along with this, there will be sort of tightening by the Fed the government would really want that there is no taper tantrum happening in our economy. They would do everything to avoid it, and therefore, risking too much by following a very consumption-driven budget making exercise. They could have risked a similar kind of a rapid escalation in the inflation numbers, and that would have further costed the poor. So they have been very careful not to go, not to be super sort of, populist driven. Given that there are
No, I agree.
any election will fall into
I
that
agree.
trap. So
I agree, and that's one of the comments that I actually made. That it's intriguing that that kind of populism has in fact been avoided with elections just not even 10 days away, the beginning of the next round of elections. Ashwini Deshpande, go ahead, ma'am. Sorry, you're on mute, ma'am. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So just a couple of things. Dhiraj made a reference to the size versus the slice issue, and Madhavan talked about a sort of a moral treatise on inequality. I just want to highlight that, of course, the size is very important, and we have to recognize that in the last 2 years, the actual size of the cake has shrunk. So it's not just about slices of the cake, but the size itself. There have been various estimates. One is 20 lakh crores. There could be other estimates, but the pandemic has reduced the size of the cake, one. Secondly, the relationship between growth and inequality is not one way. Societies with high inequality also have lower rates of growth. So even if we didn't care about inequality for any other reason, even if we were only focused on growth, we still have to care about inequality. And finally, the fact that GST tax revenues went up, and in fact, our tax collection overall went up, meant that the government actually has the fiscal space to, in fact, boost the demand side. This budget is a very supply side kind of a budget. Even as Madhavan pointed out, to the MSMEs, the support is in the form of credit, not in the form of payroll support, for example, which could have been given. Now, I don't see why all of these measures have to be seen as some harking back to some bad old days of the Hindu rate of growth or socialism. This is just, Madhavan talked about China. If you want to be futuristic or whatever visionary like China, remember that in terms of health, education, basic health, basic education to all, China was at a very different stage than we are today. Recognizing these realities, recognizing that inflation hits, especially when people are losing their jobs, I don't see what's regressive or what's
there isn't enough focus on social spending is basically
income
especially
support,
given the pandemic.
Jobs.
Income support. Professor Chattopadhyay, if you'd like, sorry, ma'am.
No, I'm saying that I agree about the point about just pushing consumption without a corresponding increase in production. That can cause a problem. That can increase imports. That can further boost inflation. But why not focus on job creation? I just don't see why not.
Fair enough. Professor Chattopadhyay, if you'd like to add to that, sir.
Yeah, I think what I wanted to say that the lower strata of the income, I don't see how they are going to gain from this growth triggered by capital expenditure. See, the multiplier effect will work, but only to an extent. The people who are at the lower strata of the society, they need to gain in the process, but we are not spending enough on basically maintaining the same spending on the employment guarantee scheme. So the basic education, basic health, the social capital, the human capital empowered growth, that is not coming. Since independence, we have had physical investment driven growth, and that has a problem. So we are achieving growth, and GDP is a misleading representation of the plight of the people who are at the down of the society, almost the down quarter of the society.
Okay, so let me get Rajat, Dhiraj, and Madhavan, and then we do have to close. Rajat, to you, you said that the government has managed to steer clear of populism, and I would agree with you on that. But to the point that it's futuristic without acknowledging the present, and the present is a country coming out of the shadows of a pandemic, where, as all the inequality reports point to, the ordinary Indian is in debt, has sold gold, has sold land. I've personally met hundreds, if not thousands, of such families over the last 2 years, that this budget doesn't speak to them. What do you say to that critique?
Well, let's look at the counterfactual. What would have the government done to sort of assuage or fill the gap that was there? Ma'am was suggesting that we should have perhaps given some payroll-based allowances and did a monthly sort of a cash transfer. every industry would have come up with it because everybody has suffered. There are hardly any, barring a few super top corporates who are there whose wealth has theoretically increased just by the account of market capitalization. Other than that, everybody has suffered. Even a lot of people have lost their jobs, and people who are still there perhaps have had to reduce their sort of expected salaries. So other than, I think, the farming sector, there is every other sector which has suffered. What could the government do in the limited fiscal elbow room that it had? I don't think much could have been done. You might criticize the ECLGS, the credit scheme for MSME, but look at the uptake. Look at the interest that the MSME has shown. It has 100% subscription. And that is why it has been not just doubled, it has been increased manyfold. Now it is to the tune of, I suppose, 1 lakh crore. So it's not like there aren't any takers and government isn't cognizant of it. But it's just that, given that the overall exercise of budget making is to steer the ship in stable waters. That is most important. You go on increasing your fiscal deficit, you will have larger macro issues. Then who's going to address that? The government is ultimately responsible for even that macro stability. So we need to account for everything.
Yeah, and I just want to say more fine print details are emerging. The spending has increased marginally, I would argue, in education and health, but it has increased. Subsidies in fertilizers and petroleum are down, but education has gone up from 88,000 crores to over 1 lakh crores. That is the education spending. And similarly, there's an increase in health spending. Madhavan, you said that the government has taken a political risk. What might that risk be defined by you as?
Let me first of all mention inflation, because I've already mentioned earlier in yesterday's program also. My idea of political inflation is qualitatively different from the economist's idea of inflation, which is just a number. Politically, people feel the heat even if their incomes have gone up, because they are used to seeing a certain budget. So this budget, because already economists, I've been watching some other show, commodity prices are going up. If oil prices go up, there is a certain clear and present danger of an across-the-board knock-on effect on things like your staples, like your food grains or onion and all. The other thing I want to say is that MNREGA, Dhiraj talked about slice and size. And one of the important things is the UPA government had brought in MNREGA as a safety net, so that the size part of the thing can be matched by a safety net, if not a slice. So the slice, so that safety net mechanism is slightly under threat right now. We can argue about health and education expenditure, which look good in numbers, but as a percentage of GDP, that's very small. So that leaves us essentially with schemes like tap water, which has got about 60,000 crores, and affordable housing or something, which has got 48,000 crores. If these expenditures by proxy play the role of an MNREGA, then the government is on safe ground. If not, in the absence of large-scale rural spending by farmers or a real payroll kind of effect, there is a certain risk where jobs may not be growing fast. On the other hand, commodities might have a knock-on effect on inflation, which will have a social and ergo a political outcome. This is I've deliberately presented a balanced picture. If tap water and affordable housing and some of the expressways create sufficient jobs to make up for the lack of safety net in the form of MNREGA, or can even take some of the cushioning of can cushion some of the oil price impact, then this government is on safe ground. But as Rajat Sethi himself acknowledges, there is certainly an inflation risk.
No, I mean, the economic survey underlines the risk of inflation. So that is obviously something the government is cognizant of. And that's an interesting argument by you, Madhavan, that has it actually steered the ship in a direction that will avert those high winds. Dhiraj, last word to you. We didn't speak too much about income tax and no change in personal income tax. If you just want to come in on that with a closing comment, Dhiraj.
No, I think, again, the fact that taxes should not be tinkered around with in every budget. So I think I'm quite okay, either raising them or putting more surcharges, or reducing them a little, changing slabs. I think none of these things one should look forward to in the budget. I think good budgets should leave these alone. I think tax horizon should be at least 5-10 years before you start tinkering with them again. So I think I'm okay. I'm okay on the tax side. Inflation is always a risk. In fact, My hypothesis, a lot of people think the UPA too lost very badly because of the corruption. I think they lost very badly because of runaway inflation. So I think this government will be very acutely aware of inflation and the risks it poses. Nobody can deny that. But at the end of the day, when we talk about jobs, when you talk about revival of the economy, where are jobs going to come from? The government, at the end of the day, government spending is only 13% of India's GDP, right? So even if the government was to spend 1 or 2% more, let its fiscal deficit go to 8 or 9, it's not going to make a big dent, and it may pose inflation risks on the other hand.
Yeah.
So I think you have a pandemic-like shock when your GDP collapses by 7% or 23% in the quarter. No government in the world can mitigate its full impact, right? So I think we have to also be realistic about that. And I think the focus should be indeed on jobs, not safety net. And jobs will only come with private investment ultimately, right? Government is not going to create jobs. Government jobs are falling. So I agree, it cannot be only one or two big business houses. It has to be a broad-based recovery. But I think capital spending and crowding in private investment is the right strategy to create jobs, which I still believe is the central challenge, much more than safety nets. Because safety nets can take you a year.
Well, I think
jobs, this economy is not going to go anywhere. So I think in terms of generating productive jobs, the government is in the right direction.
I was just going to say that the Bihar protests bring home the fact that the despair for a job is actually at the heart of everything, including social order. And those pictures are a reminder of where the youth of the country and why they're so still invested in a sarkari naukri as a vehicle for their future. So in some ways, we are, in fact, whatever word you use for it, back to the role of the state, and that is interesting for all the sort of market liberalizers. We are at the moment emerging from the shadows of a pandemic, looking at public spending as a way to buoy consumption, invite private investment, and lots of choppy waters to avert, including, as our panelists have reminded us, the rising oil prices and, of course, the emphasis that could consequences that could mean for inflation. Thanking our panel, Dhiraj, Rajat, to Professor Deshpande, Professor Chattopadhyay, and Madhavan. Thank you. There's a lot more to unpack in the days to come as we go through the fine print. I'm sure we'll know a lot more and have a more informed conversation. But in the meantime, for your first reactions, thank you very much and see you soon. Goodbye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.